Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Andres and today we're going to discuss if the Gospels are in chronological order. Most people don't know, but it's easy to figure it out. It kind of angers me a little bit that all it does, it requires a little bit of research, a little bit of critical thinking, and even though most documents are lost and we only have some excerpts, it can be figured out. If we look at the ancient Christian historians, we can go down the list. Jerome is famous for translating the Greek Bible into the Vulgate, which is a Latin Bible. Then you have Epiphanius, who wrote about the heresies. You have Eusebius, who wrote the history of the church. You have Irenaeus, who also wrote about the heresies. And Irenaeus was pretty close to the time of Christ. He lived between 125 and 200 AD. And some of his works remain. Agesippus was even closer. But all his works have been pretty much lost, so all there are some fragments and excerpts. And then we come to Papias. Papias was the earliest that we know of which there is some records. We can click on that link from Wikipedia. Let's make an extra page. And we see here Papias of Hierapolis. He wrote the exposition and sayings of the Lord in 5 books, and it is lost, except from a brief excerpts. But what's left was important enough for other people to make quotes of it. And we can find those excerpts in this link, Early Christian Writings. We click on that. We see that in the preface to the fragments, according to Irenaeus, our earliest witness, Papias, was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp, a man of primitive times, who wrote 5 books. Now, Eusebius says that John was not Apostle John, but John the Presbyter, who was the disciple and translator and secretary, basically, of John the Apostle. So we can go ahead and read what little is left from Papias. Not the introduction, the translation. Now there are a few fragments. There are only 6 fragments. And I think the there's 10 fragments. But the 6 fragments tells us, Papias, who is now mentioned by us, affirms that he received the sayings of the apostles from those who accompanied them. And he, moreover, asserts that he heard in person Aristion and the presbyter John. So note that Papias never heard Apostle John. He never heard Apostle Peter or any of the apostles. He heard the sayings secondhand from those who accompanied them, and Presbyter John, who accompanied the Apostle John. Then he says, a tradition regarding Mark, who wrote the Gospel, which he, Papias, had given in the following words. And the presbyter said this, that would be Presbyter John, Mark having become the interpreter of Peter. Now, Peter was in Rome, and everybody spoke Latin over there. Peter likely spoke only Aramaic and Greek. He wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was, however, it was not, however, in the exact order as he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. So the Gospel of Mark is not in order. That's pretty amazing. For he never heard the Lord nor accompanied him. He accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers. So what would happen is Peter would go ahead and give a sermon. He would be in the church one day, probably once a week, and he would give a sermon. And each sermon was a different story about Jesus Christ. And the sermons were not exactly in order. One day he would talk about one thing, the another day he would talk about something else, and Mark would write it down. So, who accompanied his instruction to the necessity of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's saying. Therefore, Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. He didn't omit anything he had heard, nor put anything fictitious in the statements. That is amazing. The rest is about Matthew. We'll talk about it in a second. So we come to the conclusion that Mark is not in chronological order. That is amazing. Now, of the 4 Gospels, we have 3 Gospels that we call synoptic. And why do we call them synoptic? If we make a search for the word synoptic, we'll see that it means that they are in similar sequence, providing parallel accounts of life and ministry. The term synoptic comes from the Greek synoptikos, meaning able to be seen together. That means that they follow the same order for their stories, which implies that Mark came first because he wrote down the individual sermons by Peter, and he's the one that made the mistake in the ordering because he didn't know what order they were supposed to be put together. The Gospel of Matthew must have come after because he follows the same order. And then the Gospel of Luke also came after the Gospel of Mark because he follows the same order. All 3 have the same order, and all 3, the chronological order is all jumbled. Which brings us to a very interesting point. In the past, people thought that Matthew, I think it was Irenaeus that said that, how do I get rid of this? In his commentary on Matthew, Origen said that the Gospel according to Matthew was written by Matthew the publican, and he was written first. And St. Augustine also said that they believed that Matthew was written first, then Mark, and then Luke, and then last John. So how could Matthew be first if Matthew contains the errors of Mark? So if we go back to Papias and see what he says about Matthew, we'll realize something. But with regard to Matthew, he has made the following statement. Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in Hebrew language, and each interpreted them as best they could. So Matthew wrote the sayings of the Lord, not the storyline, but the sayings of the Lord. It was a collection of sayings. And he did that first, and he says on the Hebrew language, but it was obviously Aramaic, since that's the language that Jesus Christ spoke. So here you have Mark. He writes a series of sermons, some of them out of order. And then you have Matthew, who was written first, which is just a collection of sayings. Now, interestingly enough, some German historians, when they were looking and comparing the four Gospels, they inferred that there was a common source for the sayings, and they called that source Q. Q, source of Gospels. So we can see what it says. Q source is from the German Quelle, meaning source. It's a hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings believed to have been used by the author of the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. Here we go. And now we know, well, of course, what they call the Gospel of Matthew, or what Papias calls the Gospel of Matthew, was Q, the collection of sayings of the Lord. But notice that Papias doesn't say Matthew the publican. He doesn't say Matthew surveyed Livy. He says Matthew. And there were two Matthews amongst the apostles. There's Matthew the publican, which means the tax collector, or he was also a custom tax collector. And there was Matthias, which is the same name, who was appointed apostle after Judas died. Why was he appointed apostles? Now, on the Acts of the Apostles, when they talk about what Matthew did, and there are multiple manuscripts describing the stories. And some of them put the name Matthew on it, and some of them put the name Matthias on it. It's the same name, so it was easy to get confused. So one has to be very careful when one reads the Acts of the individual apostles to see who was doing what. The name Matthias, and they didn't have the sound, TH sound. It was Matkias. The H was like a hard G. In some dialects it was silent. Some dialects it sounded like a K. Matkias. And that comes from the hero of Israel independence, Judas Maccabeus was his son. His father, here we go, was called Matityahu. That's the actual name for both of them. We call it Matatkias. It was a very difficult name to pronounce, for the Romans and the Greeks. And typically, people called Matthias also had a nickname. That's why Matthew, who worked with Romans all the time, because he lived in Capernaum, Roman enclave, had the nickname Levi, because his name was too hard to pronounce. So the question is, which one of the two wrote the sayings of the Lord? Because the assignment of Matthew the publican to the Gospel of Matthew came hundreds of years later. And my problem is when I work out the chronology is that Matthew the publican didn't become a disciple of the Lord until after the sermon of the Mount of Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount. He probably wasn't even there. He didn't start following Jesus until after. So who wrote the Sermon on the Mount? And the clue is on one of the apocryphal writings. I'll see if I can find it. Let me stop that right here. Here we go. One of the apocryphal writings that we have, one of the very few that mentions Matthias or Mattathias, says, and it's called the Book of Thomas the Contender. These are the secret words that the Savior spoke to Judas Thomas, which even I, Matthias, wrote down while I was walking, listening to them speak with one another. This is so interesting. Here we have a young guy that, as Jesus walks and talking to people, he's recording everything he says. He's within earshot. He's walking behind him, and he's listening to what he said to somebody else, and he writes it down. When Jesus Christ goes ahead and preaches, he goes ahead and writes down the speech. So why I propose is that the collection of sayings that's called Q, and people mistake with the Gospel of Matthew, was actually written by Matthias, not Matthew the Levi the publican. So he wrote those first. Then Mark came back from Italy, wrote his gospel, the Gospel of Mark, and then people realized, oh my God, the Gospel of Mark doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount. In the place where the Sermon on the Mount would be, if you work out the chronology, it should happen right before where it says, and after these sayings, Jesus blah, 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 blah. Well, what sayings? The sayings are missing. So unfortunately, in the Gospel of Mark, those pages are missing. The entire Sermon on the Mount is missing. It could be that there were scrolls, and on his trip from Italy down to Egypt, Mark lost them. It could be that he put them in a safe place for safekeeping because it was so important and he lost them. Or it could be that on that day he didn't show up and listen to the sermon, and the sermon never got recorded. But the point is, the Gospel of Mark doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount. So what they did is, that was the impetus for producing, by some people unknown, what we call now the Gospel of Matthew. They translated the sayings of the Lord written by Matthias, and they married them to the Gospel of Mark. So the main conclusion of all of that is that Mark is not in chronological order. And because they're synoptical Gospels, they follow the ordering of Mark. That means the Matthew and Luke are not in chronological order. To recap, the Gospel of Mark is not in chronological order. And this was understood by the early Christian fathers. You now understand why that knowledge has been lost. I mean, it's right there for anybody to see and research. That means that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are also not in chronological order because they follow Mark. So the question is, why do they say Matthew was written first? For example, Irenaeus says the Gospel of Matthew was written first. Origen says the Gospel of Matthew was written first. And Papias says, but with regard to Matthew, he had made the following statements. Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best they could. So it was in the Hebrew language and later translated. This collection of sayings, I claim, can be identified as Q, and it was probably written by Matthias and not Matthew, because as shown in the book of Thomas the Contender, Matthias used to follow Jesus around, writing down everything he said to other people. Now we come to John, the Apostle John. Did he really write the Gospel? I mean, he would be the only direct witness. Mark didn't know Jesus. He never followed him. He didn't know the order of sequence of the things that happened. Luke never mentions Christ, and he was decades after all the events. He tried to interview people to obtain the stories, but then most of the people had fled to Antioch in Syria and other places. And we're finding out that Matthew was just a combination of the saints, the collected saints of the Lord, and Mark. So who's there as the real witness of the sequence of the events? That would be Apostle John, if he was the one that wrote it. And there's some, how do you call it, some questions about that. But let's read what the fathers of the church and the old historians say. Jerome, in his Life of the Illustrious Men, the Viris Illustribus, says that John the Apostle was asked by the bishops of Asia to write about Christ. And there's another reason for this work, in that he had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and although he approved the substance of the story and said that the things were true, they only gave the story for only 1 year. I mean, the story was incomplete. They were missing sections of it. So he related events that were missing on the other Gospels. So here we have a direct quote of him personally writing revision or, addition to the Gospels that had already been written before on account of the bishops of Asia. Now here comes the interesting part about the dating. He was banished to the island of Patmos on the 14th year of Nero Domitian, and he wrote the Apocalypse, which is really interesting. Apparently he wrote the Apocalypse first, and then he wrote the Gospels. He returned to Ephesus under Pertinax and continued there under the time of Emperor Trajan, and died in the 68th year after our Lord's Passion. Now, the Vulgate Bible is called the Vulgate because it was for the vulgar people, the common people, and they didn't know Greek, they didn't know Hebrew, they knew Latin. So Jerome translated the Bible and made the Vulgate Bible. Now, some of the manuscripts of the Vulgate Bible have like a little introduction before each Gospel. The introduction for the Gospel of Matthew is lost, and for the Mark is incomplete, but they were likely written by Jerome himself, since he's the one that translated the Bible. But about Mark, he says, Mark recorded, who was called Colobadactylus. He had fingers that were too small for the height of the rest of his body. He was tiny fingers. And he himself was interpreter of Peter. After the death of Peter, he wrote the gospel in the parts of Italy. So the preface to the Gospel of Mark in the Vulgate Bible says that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark in Italy after Peter had died. I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, maybe Peter was still alive when he did it. But then he talks about the preface about Luke talks about Luke himself, and then at the very bottom it says, later the Apostle John wrote the Apocalypse in the island of Patmos, and then the Gospel in Asia. And that was really interesting to me. That left me flabbergasted. I all thought that the revelations came after, but no, he wrote the Revelation first when he was exiled to the island of Patmos, and then when he returned to Ephesus, then he wrote the Gospels. And that explains a lot, as we see next. On the preface to the Gospel of John, it says, the Gospel of John was revealed and given to the churches by John while still in the body. So he wrote the Gospel, and the Gospel was provided to churches while John was still alive. It's amazing. So the next is a little confusing. The close disciple of John relating the exoterics that, as in the last 5 books, that he wrote down the gospel while John was dictating carefully. So the implication there is that Papias mentions John the presbyter. So the implication is that John the presbyter wrote down the gospel while John the apostle was dictating carefully. And that explains a lot. The outcome of all of this is the Apostle John wrote the Revelation first, and then dictated the 4th gospel to John the presbyter. Now, there have been a lot of people that have expressed doubts on the authorship of the 4th gospel in the book of Revelations, in the 1st epistle of John, because the styles are different. The style of the Apocalypse is a rougher type of Greek. The vocabulary is different. And then when we get to the Gospel of the 4th Gospel, the Gospel of John, it's beautiful. It's beautiful Greek. He has a much nicer vocabulary, and it matches the Epistle of John. So it almost looks like it was written by 2 different people, and it was. Greek was the second language of the Apostle John, so it's understandable that his mastery of the Greek was not that great. So he himself wrote the Apocalypse. By the time he returned to Ephesus, he was a really old man. He must have been in his 90s or something. And he had an assistant called John the Presbyter. So he dictated to John the Presbyter, and probably in Aramaic, and then John the Presbyter wrote it all down in beautiful, flourish Greek. And that's why the styles are different. So now that we have found the, how they call it, the origin of where the 4th gospel comes from, and it was directly tied to John the Apostle, we can assume, and this is what I'm going to do for the rest of the series, that the events listed in the Gospel of John are in the correct chronological order. You'll see that there are several stories that are missing from the other Gospels, so he backfilled things that are missing. But you'll notice also that there are some stories which are repeated. Why did he repeat them? And you'll notice that the things that got repeated are the ones that are in in a different chronological order as the other ones. So what he's doing is he's placing that particular story in the proper, correct chronological order by repeating a story that's in the wrong spot on the other Gospels. So I'll leave that for today, and then using this new information, we'll follow the Gospel of John for determining when events happen, which events happen first and which events happen later, using the Gospel of John as our guide. Now, if you find this interesting, intellectually stimulating, perhaps you're learning something, give me a like, subscribe to the channel. It'll help me keep producing content. And there's so much to talk about. I mean, I get bogged down on fundamental stuff because the foundation has to be laid, but there is so much information I can give you. So please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.